Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Centre of Islamic Studies, a series of public talks. My name is Paul Anderson. I'm the Assistant Director of the Centre, and it's my great pleasure to welcome Sadek Hamid, who's a Research Fellow at the University of Wales, Trinity, St David, and he'll be talking to us today about his forthcoming publication and book, which is actually going to be coming out, I believe, on the 1st of June. So we're getting a sort of, or next month anyway. Yes, so getting some advanced notice of that. Dr. Hamid has held teaching and research positions at the universities of Chester, Liverpool Hope, Cambridge Muslim College, and the Oxford Centre for Islamic Studies. And he's the author of several books, Sufis, Salafis and Islamists, The Contested Ground of British Islamic Activism, published in 2016 with Tauris. And the co-author of British Muslims' New Directions in Islamic Thought, Creativity and Activism, published with Edinburgh University Press in 2018. And as I mentioned, most recently, the co-author and editor of Contemporary British Muslim Arts and Cultural Production, to be published with Routledge. It's a book, an unusual and interesting book, but it's actually a collaboration between scholars, practitioners, and Muslim artists. And it discusses various emerging kinds of Muslim art, British Muslim art. It discusses the whole notion of Muslim art as a category. So I'm excited to have Dr. Hamid to talk to us today on that topic. We have about 45 minutes of presentation, and then some time for a discussion after that. Okay.
Okay, so good afternoon or good early evening, everybody. Thank you so much for making the time to be here on a late Thursday afternoon. I'm sure a lot of people are probably, a little bit tired and looking forward to going home. And so for anybody who has to make a presentation this time of the day, it's always nice to see people actually turned up. And for those of you who are joining by Zoom, I appreciate you attending as well. And I'd like to first express my thanks to colleagues here at the Centre for Islamic Studies. It's an honour to be here, and I hope to share something that is going to be of interest and value to you all. So what I'd like to do is really, rather than just talk at you and fix a whole bunch of PowerPoint slides, which I think as academics and students we're very used to. I'm gonna keep it very light, really, to be honest, and provide a little bit of context and background to what this volume is about, and kind of highlight really some of the issues that we've tried to cover in the volume. It is a multi-contributor volume. It's not just myself, obviously, my colleague Stephen Jones, and hopefully, you might find out about some aspects of the British Muslim experiences, particularly the younger creatives that are actually shaping things on the ground in a way which isn't known to people outside of the British Muslim communities. So start off with the background. So for colleagues who've read academic volumes, sometimes it can take a while before they're actually published. And the origins of this volume actually go back to a conference which we organised, the academic research body, the Muslims in Britain Research Network, which I was a member of the executive committee back in 2017. In partnership with Birmingham University. That was a very well-attended, popular conference that we organised, and it was really exploring something that's not often known, or certainly not visible really in the mainstream media coverage. The fact that Muslims can be imagined outside of the normal kind of framings. When we talk about Islam in Britain, we talk about Muslims in Britain. What normally comes to your mind? If I can throw that to anybody in the audience who might want to respond. What's the first thing that comes into your mind when you think about Islam in Britain or Muslims in Britain?
Radicalization.
Unfortunately, yes. Any other particular framing? When does the British Muslim impinge into mainstream consciousness? If it's not radicalization, it's something else.
Integration.
It's discussions around,
So like the physical landscape, mosques
yes,
in some places.
yes. Or unfortunately, it is to do with another very sensitive and difficult issue around crime, criminality, the grooming issue that comes up in the news. And it's rarely, and I think as we know, when it comes to the news, it's not just Muslims, but it's very rare to find Muslims portrayed in anything but those particularly negative framings. So what we try to do with this purpose is to actually allow Muslim speak for themselves, which it sounds obvious to us, but Muslims are always spoken about, spoken for, written about, and we want to really remind people that we don't need help in that matter. We can speak for ourselves. Muslims have a voice and are perfectly capable of expressing, articulating what it means to be a Muslim in Britain today, or a British Muslim. So the focus of this conference was around the arts, culture, and creativity, and it was really showcasing the work of both academics and practitioners who work in the field of the creative industries. So we had a large number of people who were just sharing what they did when it came to both material, visual arts, poetry, literature, music, arts, as in acting, drama, theatre. We had a real broad array of different people, and so it made for a very interesting and lively conference. And what we decided as a panel was to actually try to have some kind of proceedings of the conference. So it took a while, but we eventually got there, and some of the people who were at the conference are contributors to the volume that I'm going to be discussing today. We obviously couldn't include everybody, but what we tried to do is capture the essence of that conference. So that's basically what this volume is about, really. It is quite, it's the first one is kind of, as far as I'm aware. And, we just wanted to start a conversation. I don't know if we can get rid of that corner. Or do I get rid of it now? Yeah.
Is that well enough? You happy with that?
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, right. So, as I was saying, just to reiterate the point of the conference, is to just show that the British Muslim experience is much broader than these particular negative framings that most people outside of communities are familiar with, and it's a real turn-off, and it results and reinforces stereotypes. So we've had, since over the last 20 years or so after 9/11, a whole generation of people who've grown up in the shadow of the war on terror, and literally have grown up in a securitized environment, and have suffered really the implementation of a number of different kind of social policies that essentially singled out, stigmatized Muslim communities, and that's really has huge implications, which I'm not going to go into. But literally, a whole generation of people have grown up knowing nothing but Muslims are potential extremists who are vulnerable to radicalization, or are this or are that. And what's remarkable is that most of this generation have grown up and turned out, normal and healthy and well-adjusted, regardless of that, in spite of this intense scrutiny and that stigmatization. And the headlines that we are often subjected to in elements of the right-wing press, some of these headlines you may remember from the not too distant past, are a very, very small part of what it means to be a British Muslim today. There is a lot more going on in British Muslim communities, and guess what? They're like you and me, believe it or not, Muslims have a social life. Muslims go to the cinema, they like music, they like sports, they engage in all the ordinary activities that the rest of the population does. And so I mean, it's not that we have to justify and normalize Muslims. That wasn't the intent of the volume, but we needed to shed a light on a very interesting and very much underrepresented reported and underdocumented area, the whole creative industries that are been quietly kind of developing and growing for at least the last 30 to 40 years. So it's very much an invisible phenomenon. The fact that you don't get, there isn't media attention. Well, does it, and the fact that Muslims are framed in this negative way doesn't stop people living their lives and pursuing those interests which interest them. I mean, it's very easy to put Muslims in this grievance category, and then some Muslims, unfortunately, do perpetuate that, and they themselves struggle to or reluctant to identify themselves other than the framing of the victim. And Muslims aren't victims, really. They are not, it's just a very flat, one-dimensional representation of the reality of the British Muslim experience in the UK. So this is the background that looms large, if you like, in the mainstream. But the reality, what we wanted to show through the conference and this publication is that there's a lot, there is so much going on. And what's really interesting is that Muslims who are pursuing their creative interests are starting to actually impact the mainstream. So this is, I think, something that the volume tries to express through its different contributions. And I am struggling to change frame, sorry. Yeah, so again, just to provide a bit more context and to give you an idea of, so as I say, despite these negative framings and challenges that are taking place, Muslims, remember, we live in a globalized context, and Muslims are diasporic communities, are connected and contribute to a global culture that is extremely vibrant. And people, again, if you're working in the field of Islamic studies, or you work with Muslim communities, or live amongst Muslim communities, you wouldn't necessarily know that there's huge change taking place across the world in Muslim societies, majority Muslim societies, and in minority context as well. And we're seeing the emergence of a very dynamic, creative class of or demographic, which is the millennials, the generation Zs, and even actually what they call alphas. The alphas are starting to come through as well. So these are people who are really in their late teens, early 20s, in their 30s, and even in their 40s, who are changing their societies in a way which is, again, not necessarily known to outsiders. And I think it's really, really important point to make around that these people are driving cultural, social, political change, consumption patterns, consumer, all sorts of, if you like, economies are growing out the fact that there is this youthful demographic who has purchasing power, who is educated, who is mobile, and essentially they are quietly changing the societies. And these people are also at the point of political change and resistance in certain societies to some of the more oppressive structures. I mean, we had the Arab Springs or failed Arab uprisings going back 2011, but the legacy of that hasn't gone away, even though it's not necessarily spoken about. We've had counter revolutions, and we've had all sorts of major reconfigurations of the Middle East. Those young people who are at the forefront of that change and that call for a reform and justice, they haven't gone away. They're still there. They are still there, and they've inspired a younger generation also. So these people, these young people who are adults now, married, some of them are approaching middle age, they're all part of this movement that is reinventing what it means to be Muslim in the modern world. These are people who are synthesizing and harmonizing the different dimensions of their identities, both their ethnic, racial, so in the West, it would be their citizenship identities as well, combining, being British, being Pakistani, being Egyptian, being Somali, along with, youth culture, dominant youth culture, that is again very diverse and it's very active, very dynamic, and it's a constant process of reinvention and recreation. And as we know, that is a main feature of youth subcultures. Young people, what they do, and often it is in the kind of cosmopolitan larger cities, often ends up being appropriated by corporate interests, and that then leads to fashion trends and it impacts in wider culture in that way. And we've seen that with a lot of the kind of, if you like, from the 1960s and 70s onwards, really, in terms of African American culture and how that has been appropriated by, if you like, the dominant societies and repackaged and then resold back to those Black communities. That is actually happening now with Muslim communities. Now that Muslims have become, if you like, trendy, it's now, I don't know if people are aware, in this last few years, it's actually become trendy to become a Muslim. Now that might surprise and shock some people here, if you're not aware, but there's a growing convergence of factors that resulted in people actually deliberately choosing to become Muslim. Here in the West, and we've had some notable examples which are problematic, but the figure of Andrew Tate, for example. Why did somebody who was the most Googled person in 2022 decide to become a Muslim? Allegedly, he has become a Muslim, but that's resulted in a series of other people coming with famous YouTubers and other, sporting celebrities, actors, and decided to say that they've affirmed that they become Muslim, and that has a knock-on effect. It has a knock-on effect in terms of giving a sense of pride to people who are born into Muslim families in Muslim cultures, both in majority and minority context, because suddenly it's hip, it's cool, it's trending to be a Muslim. I mean, that was inexplicable, really, not so long ago. Why would you want to become a Muslim? But a religion that is associated with extremism and violence and all sorts of negative stereotypes. Why would you want to do that? So it's opening up a conversation, and this conversation is being led by these younger demographics. So these creatives are responding to and reacting against, if you like, it's both centrifugal and centrifugal in its absorbing ideas, but it's also pushing back against the dominant popular culture, which is obviously Western. And it's really interesting. It's a process that is work in progress. It's live, it's dynamic, it's changing almost on a daily to weekly basis. You see it in the uploads on YouTube, you see in what people share on Twitter and Facebook. It's very, very kind of vibrant, and it's also contested. Young people, it's not like there's some homogenous youth Muslim youth culture. It's very internally diverse. You're having lots and lots of very lively debates around all of these issues around creativity, around what it means, to be a Muslim in Britain, or a British Muslim, or American Muslim, and it's endless, and some of it's quite interesting, and some of it's quite how can I say, off-putting as well, because it gets quite, especially in social media, it can get quite bitter and quite contentious. But the point is that it's a live conversation. It's been led by young people, and this having consequences on wider communities. Because bear in mind, young people are not separated off from their wider communities in which they live. The adults, if you like, the older generations, parents, grandparents, are often scratching their heads thinking, what is going on here? We don't understand. We were young once, but we never did that back in the day, whenever, so the parents or the grandparents' generation who came in the 1960s and settled in the UK or Europe or America, they're looking at what is going on now, and the way young people are using their devices, their phones, their laptops, and what they're watching, what they're consuming, what they're doing, the way they're changing their appearance, the way they speak, the way they walk, the way they dress, and they're like, it's it's always been the case with youth cultures. People who, who grew up in post-war generation, as we know, developed certain subcultural trends in the 1960s and 70s, and each decade has had its own youth culture, right? We know that, right? Well, what we're seeing now is cultural production being made in lifetime. This is the difference, and the pace of change. Everything has been compressed. The time periods in which change happens, where it used to happen over maybe 10, 15 years, it's happening within a matter of months now. I mean, I think we're all struggling with that. But certainly parents, looking at what is going on, this popular these urban Muslim youth cultures that are developing, they struggle with it. They're happy in some ways, and that they see that their young people, their children are very aspirational, that they are confident, that they are fully integrated, whatever that means, and they are confidently both British and Muslim. Or the point is, they feel that they belong to Britain. They're not immigrants. So the American kind of perspective on this, if people still are referred to as immigrants, even though like second, third, fourth, fifth generation people, Muslims over there are still called, immigrant Muslims. American have a different perspective, but we here, the people I'm talking about feel fully, they're here. Where else have they got to go? They're not going to go back to Pakistan or Bangladesh or Morocco. They're here to stay. They're not going anywhere, and they own their experience here. They are trying to carve their place, and part of this cultural production is saying that we are British. Right, we are as British as anybody else. But even they will challenge the notion of what British means, and this is the thing: it's this idea of speaking back to power, speaking back to the people who ultimately enabled them, caused them to be here. So the idea of that we are here because you were there, there meaning that their ancestral countries of origin. Okay, so yeah, and it's a very critical, very vocal, very confident generation, and it is global in its perspective. There is a very strong link between so-called special relationship that the politicians talk about between American and British Muslims based on their shared culture, language. Obviously, English has become the lingua franca for this generation, whether Muslims in Malaysia, Indonesia, Australia, obviously, but even places, even in Russia, Central Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, the language that everybody uses obviously is English. When it comes to tapping into this new generation that is basically causing these demographic shifts and challenging the status quo, and cultural production, creative expression is part of this resistance, both politically, but also to the status quo which is in their societies themselves. So not only do these young people speak about themselves, speak for themselves, trying to explain themselves to each other and to outsiders, they're also actually, there's a dual dialogue going on between, if you like, societies that they live in power structures, but also to within their own families, the so-called community, mosque elders, there is a challenging question that's like, okay, we're here now in the UK, we're in our third and fourth generation. Why do things have to be the way they are? Why are mosques run the way they are? Why are women treated in a certain way? Why is it that XYZ is happening in our community? So it's a very inquisitive, challenging, or sometimes disrespectful, perspective. Like why are things the way they are? We want things to change. So this feeling of wanting to change and believing they have the ability to change their immediate communities is something, again, which is a characteristic feature of this generation. I mentioned this thing about Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X being inspirational, iconic figures, and that's very much true. That obviously, those of you who know, I mean, they've had a huge impact in giving a sense of pride and kind of their own personal transformative journeys, which had a global kind of impact. They are still seen as figures that, in the recent past that Muslims can identify with and look up to, because the thing about role models is a really important thing and a really relevant issue, which, again, if you like, adults, parents trying to impart to their younger people, and that tends to be drawing back to early Muslim history and the pious examples of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. But younger people, while they respect that, what they say is, look, we have that reverence for the early figures of Islam, but what we need is contemporary examples. We need to know who can we look up to today. And at the moment, people who are filling this void are the sports stars, the musicians, the culture producers. Then, unfortunately, some of these popular YouTubers have become role models for younger people who are looking for an example of what it means to be a confident Muslim today. So in the process, what's happening is that people see these popular YouTubers and they aspire to be like them. Others are more serious and they realize that actually, if they want to make a contribution to their communities and if you like, gain recognition in wider society, they have to be good at something. They have to excel in a field for themselves and pursue their particular passion in a way which then enables them to express themselves, but also become role models. So people, rather than saying, well, I'm looking for a role model, I want to be like so-and-so, they say, well, what, I'm going to be that role model for somebody else, So that's, again, this kind of self-confidence, this exploratory, liberated, confident kind of spirit is again another feature which is characteristic of this demographic. So, I'm drawing on some of these kind of paragraphs that are kind of drawing on elements of the introduction. We talk about culture being a cumulative kind of product of how ideas, values, traditions, artistic practices are all kind of like combined and mixed up and drawing on various kind of sources, not only religion, but language, history, geography, ethnicity, local existing culture. And it's like I said, it's a very complex, active, dynamic, ongoing process. What was Muslim culture even 5 years ago? What was British Muslim culture in the mid-2010s? Is being reevaluated, it's being recontested, it's being reconfigured by young people today who are only 5 or 10 years younger than the people who are doing it. So it's like, I guess when you get to a certain age, you start to feel a bit, what's going on here? I was young once upon a time. Who these newcomers on the scene? Like you start to feel your age. I certainly feel it sometimes, because it wasn't that long ago when I was in my 20s and in my teens. But we know, for example, that between 60 to 70% of the 2 billion Muslims globally now are actually under the age of 30. And think about that for a moment. Have a think about that. Over 1 billion people are actually young, are youthful, are looking for change, are creative, are kind of impatient in some cases, and they're looking around, they're looking at their local societies and their countries and their neighbors, and they're looking to the West and they're seeing what's going on, and they see certain things in the West which they admire, they aspire to, but they think, well, actually, we'll take the best from the West, but you know what? We are going to fuse that with our own culture, with our own identity, with our own language to create something new. And that's exactly what's happening now here in the UK, being case study. It is syncretic, and it's producing all sorts of interesting things. And some of the most creative stuff is definitely taking place in the periphery, if you like. If the center is the Middle East, historically has been, the most creative stuff is taking place at the edges, arguably. It's taking place in Chicago or Bradford even, or maybe in Cambridge. Things are happening, people are doing very, very interesting things, which again, like I said, you're not necessarily aware of, but it's happening, and it's going to have it will have a consequence. And the consequence is that some of these people, these creators, are skipping forward a little bit here. Just to make my point, I'll come back. But you are getting people who are actually breaking into the mainstream. So everybody's heard of Riz Ahmed, right? Star Wars. Anybody Star Wars fans here? Yeah. He's won an Oscar last year. That's the first Muslim to be nominated and won, I think. But what he made his early career was portraying radicalized Muslims. You've all watched Four Lions, right? Oh, very interesting, entertaining, and very kind of. He made his name doing that, but he got typecast, and he realized he had a lot more to offer, and he could play different roles outside of that particular framing. So people like Nabil, Abdul Rashid, and others, kind of like they sharpen their teeth in the internal Muslim community comedy circuit. But eventually got to the point where they wanted to get mainstream recognition for their work, and then he did very well on British Got Talent. But there was some pushback on some of his content. But the point is, what I'm trying to say here is that these Muslim creatives are expressing themselves, are developing themselves, but they don't want to limit themselves just to Muslim communities. They want to, they feel that they've got something to share of value to wider society. And that's why I think it's really interesting, because historically, that's what happens. We know that it's whatever your interpretation, and I know there's an academic debate around what Islamic art is, it has had a massive influence historically. It's taking multiple cultures and vast geographical regions, but and to the point it has influenced European art. Okay, we know that, and it's a strange irony, isn't it, that even though we live in a time of increasing Islamophobia, people are very keen to go and visit the Taj Mahal or visit Alhambra Palace in Spain. They want to see the great works of Islamic culture and civilization, even though they themselves may not have had any contact with Muslims personally. They admire the historical civilizational achievements of Islam, and I think that's quite telling. So that gives you an example of how there is that creative potential that these younger creatives realize that they have within whatever Islamic art, Muslim art means, and it is up for debate. It is something that is not only of interest to Muslims. Non-Muslims are interested because in the past it's produced beautiful, amazing works of art. Okay, and it's still happening now as well. And interestingly, and historically, it wasn't just Muslims who were making Islamic art. That's something. The idea of the Islamcate, for example, that Christians, Jews contributed to the idea of Islamic art. And it took in the idea of these different art forms, these visual and material arts, taking in the best of what was already historically in across the Middle East, in Africa, India, China, and so on. It was the fact that Islam has continued to be dominant in those regions. I mean, the fact that Muslims are still there, and we're talking about conquered lands, arguably, the whole spread of Islam historically. But the fact is, those people just remained Muslims, and they produced and enhanced what they were already doing in terms of their own creative talents and skills. And we know that it's the vast area of amazing achievement wherever you go. But there is, if you like, and this again is a debate, an academic debate around, if you like, unity in that diversity, and the essence being, although some people say, well, no. But I'm personally on the side of the argument that there is an essence which basically discerns Islamic art, and that this continuity can be seen across this vast geographical diversity from Morocco to Malaysia. You'll see all sorts of different manifestations of what Islamic art and Muslim art is, or the Islamic art. You will see a certain consistency there, and that's something we talk about in introduction, and some of our contributors they explore what it actually means. What is the difference between Islamic art and Muslim art? And even within the idea of Islamic art, there are people who contest what that actually means internally. I mean, this is one of the things that communities, less so the younger generations that I'm talking about now, but certainly about 10, 20 years ago, were actually debating, what is it even possible to respond to the dominant Western culture? Because a lot of the music, the Muslim / Islamic music and the Shiite industry, fiction, what else? There's all sorts of things that were kind of like a response to the fact that young people felt left out. They didn't want to listen to Western pop music, or they felt uncomfortable, consuming other types of Western products and cultural artifacts. They wanted to create their own, if you like, substitute. They wanted to create a halal version. And certainly the whole modest fashion industry, arguably the Islamic finance, the Islamic economy, all were as a result, as a reaction to the dominant culture and the dominant kind of systems. Muslims were trying to, it's a difficult process of trying to reconcile modernity with their faith and trying to find something that approximated to a halal version or an Islamic version of modernity. And that, again, is an ongoing debate. And Muslims there are a spectrum of views around, if you like, more conservative Muslims taking a very legalistic view and saying, well, strictly pious Muslims shouldn't be listening to music. Modern pop music, modern Western music is a big no-no. But Muslims shouldn't be using musical instruments either. Muslims shouldn't be playing the guitar. Muslims should just stick to playing that drum. And actually, even should Muslims be listening to music anyway? Why don't you just read the Quran more? Why don't you praise the Prophet, peace be upon him, more? Why do we need to be involved in these kind of frivolous activities? We should be focusing more on, enhancing our personal piety and worship. And it's a very kind of rigid kind of approach, which is not, it doesn't appeal to young people. Even religiously inclined young people say, well, that's not enough. There's more to life than just worship, and the mandates and rules of Islam are just part of our lives. We want to live our lives. We want to enjoy life. How do you enjoy life? We want to do it in a way that's compatible with our faith. And so, it is a process of then trying to reconcile and referring to, if you like, modern Islamic scholarship. And there are more pragmatic scholars who've said, actually, yes, it is possible to integrate Islamic values with, or to have, if you like, a faith-based perspective or alternative to the domains of music, television, cinema, literature, etc., etc., etc. And that's an ongoing project, but it's happening. And that fixed, if you like, narrow legalistic, strict approach is really becoming irrelevant to most young people. More pragmatic approach, it seems to have kind of been that's on the day essentially. And people are just, like I said, they are producing and they're responding and generating all these very innovative ways of expressing themselves, whether it's art, whether it's spoken word poetry, whether it's exploring issues around identity. People are getting on with it now quietly, and you wouldn't, like I keep saying, you wouldn't necessarily know all this is happening, and that's what we hope to do with this publication, just to open a window and invite further research and other scholars to come along and discuss it. And the thing is, again, it's not just ours is a academic publication. There are many online publications at the moment who are exploring this. Baitul Fan, a lot of you may be aware if you're on Twitter or the internet, it's quite an innovative project which is showcasing all sorts of classical but also modern forms of Islamic art, culture, and it's a very, very visually striking and beautiful way of trying to invite people to learn more about Islamic civilization. And there are various initiatives from down the country. Hidr Collective, you've got so the Hidr Collective, for example, you can look it up. It brings together writers, illustrators, poets, filmmakers, etc., photographers. They have their own publications. There are other initiatives such as MacFest, some of you might be aware of. Kaisa Shazad from Manchester, she actually had started off with one festival of Muslim arts, which has now grown into from a northwest-based a series of events, and that's actually gone national and international. And just give you an idea that there is a lot of interest in the area of arts and culture, this is just something that which is really exciting, and people really need to have a look at it. I mean, one of the most, I think, interesting and valuable initiatives is the Everyday Muslim Project, headed by Sadek Hamid, who's it's an archiving based initiative, but it's great because what she's done and her team have done is invited ordinary Muslims to talk about their experiences of moving to the UK or growing up in the UK, living as British Muslims, and inviting people to share their family portraits and pictures and ephemera documents, and just to track that, the experience of migration, settlement, integration, and becoming British and being Muslim. And it's a fascinating project. It's oral histories as well as lots of documents, and they've even actually started partnerships with different institutions, including, I think, Oxford University have actually started partnering with them as well, if I'm not mistaken. And for those of you who are interested, in this last 10 years, it's been a huge increase in novels, autobiographies, all sorts of fiction, memoirs, and even science fiction that have been generated by British Muslims, which is, pretty fascinating, and just kind of demonstrates this creative impulse that is taking place. We even had the National Poet of Wales is actually Welsh Iraqi individual, and Isa. And that just shows that Muslims are breaking through to the mainstream and are getting recognition for what they're doing, because they're not only speaking about themselves from the point of being a Muslim, but as citizens of the UK, as Welsh Muslims, as Scottish Muslims, as Liverpudlians Muslims. Believe me, that actually exists as well. There's a whole movement around rediscovering the legacy of the early Muslim communities that were led by Abdullah Quilliam in the late 1800s to the early 1900s, and there's various academic texts and more popular texts which are really, really interesting, and they're not only of interest to Muslims who are trying to find their space in the UK, but actually this is British history. It's a wider narrative that should talk to all people, because it's part of our history of the country. And just to conclude, I don't know how I'm doing for time, Daniel. This just gives you an outline of our contents and inviting you to order it for your libraries. I'm not going to speak to this now because it's a separate lecture, but that just gives you a flavour of some of the kind of topics that our contributors talk about. 8 separate chapters in addition to our introduction and conclusion. And I hope that's been interesting. And thank you for your attention, and look forward to your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sadek, and this fascinating overview of youth cultures and emerging creative scenes, British Muslim art scenes. So we've got a bit of time now for discussion and questions, probably 20 or 30 minutes or so. So please feel free to stick your hand up, or if you're joining us online, then type a question into the chat as well. Pick that up.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Salafis. That was really, really great. And I definitely look forward to actually ordering the book and reading it as well. I don't know, this might be a bit of a big question to get us started off with. But I think one of the main questions that kept popping up in my head when I was listening to the lecture is kind of, why now, right? Because I know we're talking about second generation Muslims, we're talking about third generation Muslims, but actually we've had second generation Muslims and third generation Muslims for quite some while now. I think maybe by the 1990s, about 50% of British Muslims had already been born in the UK, for example. So, what is it about now? What's happening now that has kind of brought about this change? And I think we know from your earlier recent work that back in the 1990s, for example, second generation Muslims were attracted to transnational Islamic movements, perhaps more than they are now. Just to get us started, perhaps.
Well, do you want to respond now, or please go further questions?
Why don't you address that?
Yeah, so thank you, Imran. That's a good question. Why now? You're certainly right in that. Again, I have made this point that, we are into our third and fourth generations, but it is the fact that people, it's one that people want to be known. They want people to know that this is what's happening. It's not just all doom and gloom and radicalization and extremism. And that we move beyond the issues that have, in a sense, imprisoned us, the framings that have kind of contained a very narrow aspect of the British Muslim experience, which is not, it's totally skewing external perceptions of these diverse communities. So it's not so much timing wise, it's an inevitability, I guess. If people want to tell you this is what's going on, this is what's happening, in wider society, and certainly if we want to be an inclusive, multicultural, multi-faith society, as we are reminded, and certainly the new king likes to emphasize. But we need to recognize all the contributions of our minorities, and Muslims are the biggest faith minority in the country. And I think still, even though Muslims have been here for, in significant numbers since the 1960s, and now we're up to nearly 4 million. But it's remarkable how much ignorance there is still of Muslim communities. So this publication, anyway, is just a contribution to that process of increasing public literacy of a very significant minority, because that minority, as I said in the beginning, is constantly being spoken about and written about when it's not necessary. It was never necessary anyway. We didn't need translators. Even in the 1960s, people perfectly fluent English. There were people who could communicate and did communicate. I mean, we're talking about a particular period of the Muslim settlement in the UK. Obviously, it was very significant in the 1960s. But as I've hinted at before, there were English-speaking Muslims, not only natives, but there were others, very significant communities in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, and throughout the 20th century. It's just that our historical memory really only extends to the last 30, 40 years, where Muslims have burst onto the mainstream consciousness, particularly after post-Rushdie in 89, right? We didn't really talk about Muslims as Muslims then. Before Rushdie, we referred to them as Pakistanis or Arabs, or whatever. It was an ethnic kind of definition or identification. But now, we talk about Muslims as if they're all the same, and as if that's all there is going on in their life. So it's really so the question is, why not now? Why not before? Well, I guess it's a maturation, I would say. These younger communities, these third generation millennials and generation Z, they just wanted to claim the narrative for themselves and not want necessarily even, second generation, my generation, to talk about what it means to be British. They want to talk about it themselves, and they are doing it. And I think perhaps the most vibrant place is social media space, because it's just anybody can set up shop in their bedroom or in their front room and talk about what what's important to them, and it's clearly has a national audience, and people outside of the UK are very interested to know what British Muslims think, do, behave. And arguably, British and American Muslims are the most influential in diaspora globally, and they are setting the trends. They are shaping the popular conversations that are taking place even in majority Muslim society. So it was kind of inevitable. What I mean? Yes.
So we've got a question from Hamdi online. I have a specific question. Are museums and galleries doing justice to the identity and belonging of Muslims in their spaces? If so, how and who is involved? And if not, any recommendations for this social change?
Well, yeah, thank you for the question. The short answer is no. They are generally not getting the access and the recognition and the inclusivity that is required, and that's one of the things that we discuss throughout the volume, and the different contributors talk about the challenges faced by Muslim artistic practitioners. People want to exhibit. The examples which a handful of that we've cited are really, very few and far between. There are all sorts of structural barriers to Muslims accessing these mainstream institutions, and there are reasons for that, both which are unfortunately based on racial discrimination, as also, frankly speaking, Islamophobia. I personally know of colleagues who have struggled to get their work exhibited, people who are now trying to initiate projects which have been rejected, denied access on all sorts of spurious grounds, and that is a real challenge for people. And it's disheartening, and for some people it really demoralizes. For others, they see it as a challenge and say, well, no, okay, I haven't been able to have my work exhibited here, but I'm gonna find a way. And people, for a lot of people, it provides motivation and fuel for the fact that they are not going to accept this exclusion from the mainstream. And that's one of the things that we talk about in the volume, with some solutions as well, hopefully.
So the answer is buy the book.
Yeah.
Buy the book, please.
So coming from a particular generation growing up in the 70s and 80s, we always had an identity crisis. So are we British or are we Muslim? Do you think the younger generation, current generation, are more comfortable in their own skin, i.e. being Muslim and British? Do you think we've got over that sort of hurdle of the identity crisis?
It's a good question and very current stuff. I think, in my view, I think for most young Muslims today, it's a settled question in the sense that they don't see a theoretical problem with being both British and Muslims. However, in their day-to-day experiences, they're frustrated that they aren't seen as fully British. So while they themselves walk around, they don't have an identity crisis anymore necessarily, like some people did. We did struggle with being Pakistani and British or Moroccan and English. I think it's not so much in the mind, it's in their daily lives, where it does make them question. It does make them feel, well, I've done everything. I've gone to school in this country, I've gone to university, college, I've got a job, and I work with non-Muslims. But why do people look at me differently? Why do people treat me differently? Why are there unspoken barriers to me progressing and having social mobility and being accepted in life? Because you see, while they themselves as individuals feel fully British and Muslim, and with all this diversity, they are constantly receiving pushback from the mainstream, society questioning, it's still rehashing very dated Orientalist framings of, can Muslims be fully British? Can Muslims do this? Are Muslims, are they, should we be worried about them? And all sorts of kind of, so as much as Muslims personally, individually feel British and Muslim, they know that society, elements of society, elements of the media are still questioning their very existence here. And then we know there's a global rise in xenophobia, racism, and Islamophobia, and we see that on the continent particularly acutely. In France it's particularly bad, as I think many people know. Like, you can't be French and be Muslim because it's just not possible for people in the elites. It's an issue, and so Muslims are still seen as a problem. And I think that is what we are struggling here today with as well, both in terms of the kind of like exclusionary narratives that have become popularized, but also the fact that at elite level, but even everyday people, people will have problems getting jobs. Even though they might be as qualified as their non-Muslim friends, they will get people judging them and looking at them differently. They go to sort of an obvious example is when Muslims go to the countryside. You know what I'm talking about here, people. You go outside of the largest cities. If you go to parts of the UK where there aren't many brown or black people often look at you and think, "What are you doing here?" As if you're not meant to be here. I mean, and that's the fact. That is still Britain today, 2023. You look slightly different. You've got a slightly different complexion. People will question you, and it's not just Muslims. It's Gypsies. It's Roman people. It's black people. It's unfortunately, and that is modern Britain today. We still haven't got over our kind of racial kind of neurosis and the whole kind of legacies of empire, unfortunately.
Thank you.
I've got one online if you're second, and we to work with technology. From Rama, in terms of the younger generation and their attempts to reconcile their British identity and their Muslim identity, how do we deal with the misrepresentation, misinterpretation of Islam that is presented with platforms like TikTok and YouTubers who encourage things like, quote, red pill Islam?
Ooh, that's a juicy topic, isn't it? So it's two parts, I think, to that question. Yeah, in terms of addressing misrepresentation, misinterpretation, I think that's an ongoing task for Muslim communities in the sense of articulating for themselves, which is happening anyway. But I would say also it's not the job just of Muslims to, it's not, the burden is not on Muslims just to explain themselves. Why do we Muslims always need to explain themselves and represent themselves and disassociate themselves from negativity or, you know, whatever thing that troubles mainstream society? I think mainstream society, our institutional structures, politicians, policymakers, media, and other agencies need to, and ordinary people need to really make an effort to understand Muslims. It goes both ways. The idea of integration and understanding, it comes from human contact. So as much as Muslims will go out there and, I don't know, do information stalls or visit my mosque and, get to know your Muslim neighbor, that's all good. But, wider society needs to actually play its role as well, and it needs to make an effort. And it's happening. And the great thing is happening. But I think, there seems to me there are vested interests who want to maintain these barriers, these unspoken divisions and perpetuate stereotypes and prejudice. So, we can't be naive about it. There are elements of British society that want to maintain the status quo, wants to increase divisions that are occurring in our society. And I think, so it's a collective task, I think, for all of us.
I wonder if I can ask a question about, I was just intrigued by your comments about, I think it was the comic who was at a certain point, had sort of success on a kind of British Muslim circuit, and at a certain point felt typecast and sort of wanted to, was that right? Wanted to kind of reach other audiences. And I thought that was interesting because of this sort of idea of, the category of British Muslim art, which is, I'm sure you sort of discuss this in the book, but because on the one hand, as you said, art is about, has this great power to enable people to escape the dominant framings, the ways that people are, mainstream society is looking at you, and actually to set the terms of identity and self-representation, themselves.
Yeah.
But then you have the category of Muslim art or British Muslim art, where I suppose you're expected to sort of foreground Muslimness or an aspect of British Muslim experience or faith or whatever. So I wonder whether, what that's doing actually to this sort of idea of British Muslim art. Is it constraining or is it empowering, or do different artists sort of have different takes on that question at different times?
Yes. Yes, that's a good point. Question. I let's try to. It's doing both. It is constraining, but it's also inspiring people to resist and to continue to push forward and to overcome those visible and invisible barriers and the limitations, because especially creatives are, they're co-creators by definition. They are thinkers. They find ways to solve problems, and if they come across a hurdle or rejection or having a door slammed in their face, usually they say, okay, I'll find another way, and they do. So yeah, and on an individual level, people do get disheartened, no doubt. Human beings at the end of the day. So in the case of Nabil Rashid, the comic, he not only did he not make it and win. I don't know if any of you watched his performance. It was some of his pieces were quite controversial and quite how can I say, very sharp social criticisms, and I think some people were offended how raw he was and how frank he was, and that's his personality. But he is an acute social observer, even though you may not agree with all of his opinions. But the point is that he received thousands of complaints, and if you actually examine the complaints, it was actually, they were quite shallow complaints. We just people who were triggered. Who were, to use this phrase, the white people who got triggered by what he was saying when it came to race and religion. And this is the thing where we have this unspoken, unresolved tension in our British society. We don't like to talk really about race and racial injustice and racial justice and the whole, especially in the last few years. There's been a lot of gesturing, public rhetoric around we need to do more and we can be better and we need to address our, the legacies of empire and, but what's happened as the last 2-3 years have rolled on is very little has changed. And if anything, all these various scandals that are cracking open about institutional racism in the police and racism here and racism in our mainstream society as well as the top of society and amongst the politicians is that we haven't sorted out race. We haven't dealt with it. We haven't come to terms with it. We don't want to talk about it. So people get very, very defensive. That's the white fragility aspect of it. But these are difficult conversations. And if we're going to move together forward as a society, we need to talk about these uncomfortable things. And we need to educate wider society, but particularly our young people, and include and broaden our particularly history curriculum at schools. So there's lots of things. I mean, these suggestions, practical solutions have been advocated by campaigners and educationists already. It's not like we need to go and find out ways in which we can address this issue. Lots of people have been campaigning for decades and providing alternatives and ways in which we can broaden our historical awareness. But they are rejected, and there is a defensive kind of response to when people say, "Look, we need to talk about difficult issues." The response, the kind of knee-jerk response is, "Well, oh no, that's divisive. No, we can't talk about that. It's not true, and Britain is great, and you are. I mean, turn it back and you say you're actually creating further division in society. We're talking about what's different between people and why people are this and that, and that is so we're in denial. There's a lot of collective denialism taking place, I think, and until we feel comfortable talking about it, we're not going to move forward. And obviously, the structural inequalities are addressed as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. My question kind of follows on from Paul's actually. And I'd love to know more about how you see art specifically fitting in with this, given the contents of your volume. I mean, I do a lot of documentary work to talk about things that are less controversial.
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes when you do hit people with the controversial point, they're resistant. But when you come at it in a different way, and I guess I feel that coming at it through art and creative culture is coming at it from a different way. And it's saying, okay, yeah, we have this argument about who we are and identity, but we also have this space in which we share something and we can enjoy something together. And I'm particularly interested about it overlaps between Muslim culture and Black culture through different types of music and social media and shared tropes, because you'll find a lot of grime, there is a chapter on grime and hip hop, where there'll be a lot of references to Islam. Yes. Even if the singer is not necessarily themselves a practicing Muslim. Right. And I find that really interesting, how it's sort of seeping in almost without people being aware of it. And I wonder if you see sort of a certain potential in that, in it not being Muslim art, but in being forms of art and creation which have a much wider appeal.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Mill. I'm actually a fan of your work. You're right in that. I think obviously art is a universal language, transcends. We know that, and that is really points to and why this is so potent, and it is bringing people together. And certainly, I agree with you. It's different strategies, I guess. Young people, some people are very direct and confrontational and feel that they need to be in your face and challenging, but then other people are taking that more pragmatic approach and are doing that kind of stuff that you do in terms of public education, producing documentaries, exhibitions, all sorts. So they are doing that. So it's not just. I mean, I've went through a whole bunch of stuff. We do try to capture some of that kind of diversity of approach and strategies. And I think certainly it is more. It's less intimidating, and people are more likely to respond to you if you start off on a point of shared commonalities. And I think certainly, there's some great books that are coming out at the moment, digging into our recent past and how much Islam and the West have actually enriched each other, and not just that the narrative around that Islamic civilization is solely responsible for the Europe and all the great achievements. The fact that it's actually been a co-creation, and so I think some of the more, if you like, more sensitive, more subtle approaches by certain young people is actually to talk about shared histories, shared commonalities, shared humanities. And that's happening, definitely happening. And you're right. I mean, that those points you've made, believe it or not, are covered by Abdul Aziz in his chapter. He does actually pull up. There's actually quite a growing literature on the overlap between the kind of African American experience and the fact that at the end of the day, a lot of the people who were instrumental in various aspects of that movement, of those kinds of expressions, were actually Muslim. And that's something that the younger generations are discovering now. And it is a point of connection and overlap. And I think certainly that's why we mentioned the figure of Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali, because these people, they had a transatlantic connection. Malcolm visited the UK in his last year, as we know. Muhammad Ali visited over various decades, and these people still have an influence. But there is that certainly with the idea of the other colleagues have talked about the idea of a Muslim Atlantic. Now there is a Muslim Atlantic kind of drawing on mistakes, Black Atlantic, who's Paul Gilroy's work, and he makes his point about the closeness between Americans and British, and then the differences as well. And the fact that it's happening now amongst the creatives, amongst British and American Muslim creatives, it's that overlap. It's a constant thing. Before it was, if you go back to the 90s, it was, for example, initiated by a lot of the well-known public speakers, Muslim American. A lot of them African Americans used to come to the UK who were preaching, but now it's obviously we live in a digital age where it's instantaneous and people are constantly sharing and exchanging content, and the English language is that kind of shared kind of platform in people. And so the idea of the Anglophone Muslim sphere now is something, by the way, Abdul Aziz has written about, which is quite an interesting paper if you want to look that up. And it's happening, so it is happening, and I think you are right. I think people are more receptive if you come from a point of shared similarities rather than making people feel bad about what their ancestors may or may have not done. So yeah, it's happening. Both things are happening. Yes.
My question is mainly about creative cultural production on digital spaces, and that's something I work on in my PhD as well. So I'm mainly looking. I mean, I wanted to ask whether there has been any consideration of politics of algorithm when we talk about politics of algorithms. So
Okay, yeah.
What you consume and you see more of that. So instead of the Muslim creative production reaching out to people, it is in fact just getting to a digital bubble. You know what I mean? Like there is production and the consumption by people of the same religious background. So instead of reaching out, as you said in the beginning, it is merely just limited to that bubble of production and consumption within Muslim community, global Muslim communities. Or are there any studies that disprove?
That's a very good question. It's actually one of the things I'm looking at now with my colleagues about the Digital British Islam Project. And you're right, there is certainly an interesting, I call them a clique of English-speaking preachers and apologists who have captured a large demographic of young people with a very kind of narrow, conservative, I'd argue supremacist readings of Islam. But they have this, they try to portray themselves as being the mainstream and representing Islam, and they've appointed for themselves this kind of like spokesmen for Islam, and in reality they are unqualified. They're not representative, and what they have done is that they speak to topics in a controversial way, and they adopted all the kind of the most effective ways of capturing youth audience, and they have created these bubbles which are quite problematic. So yes, that's happening, no doubt, but it's, I think, very early days. There isn't enough literature on this. I'm not aware. I mean, and this is something we hope to contribute to advancing understanding how these particular bubbles are functioning and why they're so popular, and the consequences of that. So, for example, like something I wrote a brief journalistic article last week, actually, if you want to look it up, it's in Hyper. The danger of YouTube preachers like Muhammad Hijab, if people may have come across him. You may have noticed about a month ago, he went and excommunicated the new leader of the Scottish National Party, Hamza Yusuf. Did you know about that?
No.
Yeah, apparently he's an online mufti. So he could go and, because he disagreed with something that Hamza Yusuf said around same-sex relationships and sexuality in Islam and so on. And you can look that up again. But he basically, I don't know why he thought he could actually, he went out and he made a point. He made a 7-minute video saying Hamza Yusuf isn't a Muslim. He's not a Muslim. He's not a Muslim. It's very theatrical. That's the whole style. But it created a lot of online traffic and debate. And really, it's indicative of a problem with this particular type of Muslim apologetics, which, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, even, it would have been insignificant. But now it has millions of people, young people, who are following the words of these people. Because Muhammad Hijab himself has nearly 1 million followers, I think. Ali Dawah has nearly, and these people, it's quite serious, because people are listening, young people are listening, and they have adopted this informal religious authority, which they have no right to. So it is quite serious, and I think something, we are observing, but I don't think the literature is there yet. Hopefully we can contribute to that.
Wait your PhD.
Sorry?
We'll have to wait for your PhD.
No pressure.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed, Dr. Sadek Hamid. It's been a really fascinating overview and discussion, and a plea for sort of wider artistic and cultural programming in this country. So it's really a very valuable talk and presentation. So please join me in thank you.